Hi, welcome again to another podcast from Erasmus House Publishing. Today we ask a hot potato question: what's so difficult about loving thy gay neighbour, or any neighbour for that matter? The classic text here, of course, is Matthew 22:39, the so-called Golden Rule, where Jesus famously says, "Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself." Okay, seems pretty simple, so what's all the fuss? Say someone tells their gay neighbour to stop his or her lifestyle, or that the gay way of life is sinful. Is that person then guilty of not loving their neighbour? Should they perhaps not have said anything at all in the first place? First things first, it goes without saying that Christians should show love and compassion to the world around them, and it's tragic when that doesn't happen. So let's take a closer look at that age-old phrase, love thy neighbour. What does it in fact mean? Is there anything that we're missing? Well, what is often overlooked in interpreting this verse is that here in Matthew 22, Jesus is in fact quoting from the Old Testament. He's quoting from, in fact, the book of Leviticus, here at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, which reads, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself." Again, seems pretty simple, self-evident you might say. Show love to those around you, what not to understand. But what people often forget is the context. The previous verse, verse 17 in fact, elaborates on what is included in this idea of loving one's neighbour. To love your neighbour, according to the context here in Leviticus 19, also includes, according to verse 17, one verse back, quote, "Do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbour frankly, so you will not share in their guilt." So what this means, putting verse 18 together with verse 17, is that if you really love your neighbour, you will in fact tell him or her when and how they are sinning or doing wrong. And if you don't, according to the passage, you will in fact be sharing in their guilt. It means that yes, God will certainly blame that neighbour for what he or she is doing wrong, but it also means God will blame the believer for not warning that neighbour and exposing their sin. So if in fact we want to be fair to the idea of loving one's neighbour as Jesus would have understood it, we must include the idea of rebuking our neighbour when we see him or her committing a sin. Now, what is the upshot of all this? Very simply, that if we truly love our gay neighbour, then according to the Bible, to name and expose that sin in his or her lifestyle is in fact the biblical thing to do. It is in fact part and parcel of loving thy neighbour. Now the important proviso here is that we don't do so in a spirit of judgment or condemnation. We do so in a spirit of love and humility, and in the Holy Spirit. The purpose of the church here on earth is to change the world in the same spirit Jesus showed by his example. This means, yes, exposing sin, but it also means doing so in the right spirit. Love is great, nothing against love. In fact, God is love. But at the same time, we've got to make sure we know exactly what love is, according to the biblical definition of the word. Love is not just a warm, fuzzy feeling. Love is more than that. Love also means doing and saying something to help people who maybe don't want to hear what you've got to say, but who still need to hear it nonetheless. And if we refuse to help those in need for fear of offending them, then we are not, in fact, according to the Bible, actually loving them. Yes, there is such a thing as tough love. Leviticus 19:18, love thy neighbour, in fact includes this very idea of tough love. Included in the idea of the passage is that if we are to see somebody doing something wrong or living a sinful lifestyle, and we let them carry on in that lifestyle, then we are not in fact actually loving our neighbour at all. So when churches don't speak from the pulpit about social issues, out of fear of what people will think of them, or perhaps out of the idea that they will not be showing true love to them if they do speak out, then those churches are actually not loving their gay neighbour at all. Let's look at another passage. Let's look at Matthew 7 verse 1, another very famous passage. Jesus says, "Do not judge and you will not be judged." It's also often used in this debate. Does that passage mean that we are not allowed to call someone out on their lifestyle? In fact, when Jesus says "do not judge" in Matthew chapter 7 verse 1, he's talking about judgmental attitudes. He's talking about harsh attitudes of the heart, such as, for example, the Pharisees had. He is not talking about rationally assessing if something is sinful or not. It's perfectly possible and perfectly reasonable to assess rationally and reasonably whether someone is in the wrong, yet at the same time not have a judgmental attitude towards them. In fact, it is sometimes, many times, a necessary part of life to do so. In fact, 11 chapters later, in Matthew chapter 18, verses 15 to 18, Jesus commanded the church judge someone who has sinned, and even excommunicate the sinner from the church, if necessary. This is not the same as the "do not judge" of 11 chapters earlier. To discern if someone is sinning and to speak out about it is a perfectly reasonable part of Christianity, and even a perfectly reasonable part of everyday life in the right context. There is simply too much wrong with the world around us for us to be gagged from speaking out against it. Perhaps it's precisely because of the great extent of sin in the West at the moment that the world tells the church to keep quiet, even trying to use the Bible to get us to keep from speaking out against them and exposing the world's sin. As the Apostle John famously said, the reason the world doesn't want to come into the light is because it is afraid its deeds will be exposed. Darkness doesn't like to come into the light. Light on darkness, not a good idea as far as the darkness is concerned. So whether the world tells the church to be quiet, or even uses their own Bible against them, or by outright persecution, the world will, one way or another, try to snuff out that light of the world, the light of Christ shining through the church, the only thing that gives light to a world in darkness. One of the greatest ironies in the cosmos is a world that fights like anything to get rid of the only thing that can in fact save it. But speaking out against sin is in fact a part of what Christianity is, and a part of what it has always been. The trick is that it needs to be done in the right spirit and with proper discernment and wisdom. When we get this right, we achieve proper balance in our Christianity. And this, according to the Bible, is how we truly love thy neighbour.